Good afternoon, folks. I'm Pallavi Karan, your host for this session. So what do you guys think about the year 2023? How has it been? This is the year of transition, where everything is now going back to the pre-pandemic era. And so is the market dynamics, which is going to change yet again. Now, in these changing times, the product leaders have a Herculean task ahead of them. They have to successfully navigate the complex and rapidly changing market dynamics. Doesn't this appear to be a daunting task to you all? Wouldn't it be interesting to learn from some of the industry experts and be prepared? So without any further delay, let me call upon stage our conference chair, Deepika Bajaj, who will be the moderator for this panel. So welcome, Deepika. Our first panelist is Deepak Vishveshwaraya. Deepak is currently the Vice President of Platform Engineering and Site Managing Director at Pegasystems. He specializes in leading large engineering organizations, driving innovation, and bringing products into global markets. Welcome, Deepak. Next, we have Pallavi Srinivasa. Pallavi is currently the Vice President of Product Management at Synaptic. Her areas of expertise include product management, cloud services, data centers, campus switching, product marketing, and user experience design. Welcome, Pallavi. Let's move on to our next panelist, Sumanta Das. Sumanta is currently the Director of Product Engineering, QuickBooks Online Intuit. He has experience around building world-class software products around small and medium business and fintech domain. Welcome, Sumanta. And next, we have Prasanna Alagesan. Prasanna has worked extensively in education startups from being the early member of Byju's. He is the co-founder of Career Labs. Career Labs is focused on solving for skilling through career support platforms for college students. So now we have all the panelists on the stage, and let's get started on the panel discussion centered around emerging scope for product ownerships in India. Over to you, Deepika.
Thank you so much. Great. So we are going to think about the environment. We've been talking about products and how to build products, but let's talk about a little bit about what's happening in the industry. And I'm very excited to have this amazing panel here. So I'm going to just start my question with Sumanta. Maybe you can start with that. I would like to get your perspective on the change in product ownership as you see it right now. And I also want you to provide us some context in global context with it, and what are the areas we need to be focused on.
Thank you, Deepika, and nice to be here. My name is Shumanto. I represent Intuit. Just to give some context in terms of how the world of product ownership is changing, specifically in the context of we being product leaders based out of India, but building products not only for India market, but also for global markets. So I think I'll touch upon two areas. One is how the market itself is changing when it comes to technology. And just to walk you through a quick 2-minute snapshot of how the journey for Intuit has been. Last week we just celebrated 40 years of Intuit, and you must be wondering, wow, 40 years in the tech world, and we have been there all along. I think the only secret of success, we being 40-year-old tech company, when the whole tech world itself is probably little more than 40 years, is primarily because of one thing: we have been disrupting ourselves. It's primarily, if you really look at the last 40 years of how the technology shift has happened, we probably started off with the era of DOS computing and then kind of moved to mainframe computing. Then in the 90s, it was all about Windows. In the 2000, it was the era of internet. And in 2010, it actually started with the era of mobile. And then in the late 20s is when the cloud, as well as now we are leading with AI and ML, right? So what is more important when we are building products is not only to adjust to the trends, but also leapfrog in terms of how we can really leverage all of these technology shifts that are happening and at the same time how the markets are opening across. Like, I can share my experience. Like, I have been with Intuit for the last 12 years, and prior to that I was kind of building products even based out of India. I think the major shift that I have seen myself is, earlier we were more focused around building things which are primarily siloed in nature, but very recently, maybe over the last 5 years, we are now seeing that the boundaries of global economies are actually blurring. So which essentially means that if you are building something, build it for the world. Don't just think about the current market that you are looking for, but start thinking about how you can really scale it, how you can build it as a capability. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is more around the whom are you building the products for. One of the interesting things that has happened now recently is the user base who is going to use the next generation of products, they have completely different needs of what the current users have been. I'm basically talking about the Gen Zs and the Gen Alphas. By 2030, almost 50% of the workforce will be Gen Zs and Gen Alphas. These are people who are born in the internet age. These are people who have never seen what the world was like without mobiles, without data. So the way of thinking in terms of what you really need to build into the product is completely changing. So which means that we need to be more tuned in terms of who these customers are, who these users are, what their intentions are, what triggers them. I think these are the things which really, really matter a lot, and that is where probably we should be kind of focusing on.
Great. I'm going to pass it on to Pallavi. Pallavi, you've probably been in technology for all your career. And as you've seen, there's something called product-led growth strategy, which is kind of a business strategy that has now kind of driven the next growth of product suite that we've seen coming up. I would love your perspective on how does now product management and engineering fit in an organization where it has more scope in terms of looking at the market, be it from perspective of pricing, be it from perspective of working closely with other functional areas. What are the areas where you see that we really need to be focused on as the world changes around us?
Thank you. First of all, thanks for the opportunity. I've always been, I think I've been fortunate enough to be part of the product-led growth as part of my entire journey. But what I do notice is when I moved to India, I did see that there was a lot of different ways of people driving this particular strategy. I think the product-led growth is something that always brings you to the sustainable way. If you look at it from any other angle, we've had companies where sales-led, we've had companies where finance-led, and I'm talking about people who lead from the front. And we've had companies where people say it's R&D, but it's a combination of product management and engineering. And those are the companies where you see there's an inherent growth and a long sustainability. And that's the space that we should be focused on. And I'm a big believer in product-led growth. In terms of answering your second question on the skill set, I think the folks, as a product manager, I remember when I was younger, I used to, product manager, I know everything, and I'm going to, tell you what to build. As I, went through the system and grew older, I realized that's not the case. Yes, you may be aware of, you may be a bit closer to customers. You may look at how they're doing things. But at the end of the day, they're all human beings. And you are able to understand and distill what is beneficial for you and the organization. But you still have to work with people who will help you on the finance front, who will help you on executing it, who will help you manufacture that supply chain. All of that, if you work with them very well, yes, you still own the product, but you need to bring everybody along with you. right? So that's the skill set that we are talking about, bringing people along. And once you focus on that, it doesn't matter whether it's a Gen Z, Alpha, or you're building for the, my generation. It's all the same. You will be able to succeed, not only thrive, win in that particular space.
So, in sum, we are looking at now becoming more collaborative versus being in a siloed role as a product manager.
Certainly, most certainly. I think that's the only way to go.
Okay, great. Deepak, I love your perspective. So, Deepak has worked across both sides of the pond. So, he has a lot of experience working in different markets. Deepak, I would love to understand, given the product landscape is changing, we see products like ChatGPT, Metaverse, AI. These are not traditional products like an ERP or a CRM solution. How do you see what is the impact and what will that mean for the future?
That's a great question. I think almost everyone is probably talking about it, right? In terms of what does the future look like. As Deepika talked about, you can probably see I spent 35 years in the industry, so don't have much left anymore to do that thinking. But having said that, it's given me a great perspective in terms of playing different roles in different geographies and being able to do that. Technology is always shifted, right? There is always change, and if you don't expect the change, I think like Payal was talking about, you will probably in that bottom of the pyramid, and if you don't adapt to those changes, you will find yourself at the bottom of the pyramid, right? I loved the thought process in terms of what Payal talked about in terms of putting out your hand. This is a bit like that, right? It's not about seeking. You're never going to be in the part of the, top of the pyramid because all the decisions about you are done, when you are not there, like a thing, right? Very, very similarly, irrespective of whether you are in it or not, these kind of technologies will come. These kind of technologies will shift. These kind of technologies, will cause, some of them will cause evolutions and revolutions, right? So what is happening today with technologies like ChatGPT or, not necessarily ChatGPT as a particular thing, but think about more as a generative AI, technology as such, right? ChatGPT is one instance or one example of that. Whether it is Metaverse, whether it is, 5G, for example, what kind of things you think. I think you have to look at in terms of how do I jump on that opportunity, right? And how is this going to change? I think this is going to be, revolutionary. In my own perspective, I think something like ChatGPT, for example, I think it's going to be the next iPhone moment, right? When iPhone came, it was not really just about the phone, the device. Yes, that looks great. The experience is good. But that's really not what happened. If you think about it in terms of what happened, the entire shared economy came into existence because of that iPhone. All the Ubers, the Swiggies and the Zomatos and whatever else you can think of, the DoorDashes of the world, right? Where do you think they all came from? That all came from because it enabled that transformation in the industry. Similarly, I believe, technologies like the generative AI, which is like a ChatGPT or what have you, will actually drive the next, big evolution in technology, right? I'll tell you just Wednesday, actually, this week, on Wednesday, we actually had a global hackathon that was completely focused on ChatGPT, right? In the entire company, right? We called it a GPT-a-thon for that matter, right? And we had more than 500 people participating just from India, right? And it's really about being able to experiment, being able to learn some of those skills and being able to, not only learn about skills, but also things, figure out things that are relevant, to what we are doing, to what, to the company that you're working for or, whatever your role is from that perspective, right? So things like in terms of how they are applied is very important, and that's what is going to drive. Not only just about being able to drive, I also want to take a moment to be able to put a put a perspective of the opportunity in front of us, right? I think earlier Sumanta was also talking about this opportunity from a product ownership perspective, from a global point of view, especially in these areas. Let's say, for example, in terms of generative AI or, metaverse or what have you. Think about metaverse in terms of the applications or opportunities that gives us, especially in this world, in terms of the hybrid world. We're all coming back from this whole pandemic, and things have changed. It's probably never going to be the same as what it was 3-4 years ago. And metaverse is one aspect that will help in terms of how to bridge that. Right, and how do you really operate, in a hybrid world? Because, not everybody is going to be in the same room at any given point in time. There's always somebody who's going to be remote, and how do you handle that? So technologies like these are going to cause that shift. If you think about the opportunity to be able to adopt these things, the next 15 years, probably 10 to 15 years, there is nowhere else in the world that you would probably want to be than right here. And I'll tell you why. One, I think, Sumanta talked about the people capital, the human capital that we have, right? By the way, we are number one, by the way, if you guys didn't realize that, right? We are number one in terms of human capital. We have the youngest average age of a country, of the largest democracy in the world. We've got to think positive, and how do we leverage that, in this opportunity. Right? Second, we have the largest per capita data usage of any country in the world. Right? In fact, we are number one, and you can, number two is US, number three is China, and you can add those two up. It still doesn't, reach up to number one, right? That's the power of, what we are seeing. You can think about in terms of all the models, whether it is B2B, B2C, D2C, I'm sure a couple of more will come, in addition. And how do we apply these technologies in all of these worlds? And most importantly, doing that for global consumption. Right? I think Sumanta referred to that as well, and I echo that. I think so. Fantastic opportunity for these technologies over the next 10 to 15 years. So we should really be jumping on that.
I love that perspective of the convergence of the physical and the digital world, right? And how that is going to change how we experience everything as a consumer from the technology perspective. With that, Prasanna, I'm going to come to talk to you about the ad tech world. Education is always been one of India's primary thing, and it's a huge opportunity here. And when you think about that in a B2C perspective, and you think about taking that conversation at a point where we are a little apart from what we've traditionally done, what are the areas you think are going to be shifting, and how do you think that that is going to impact the end user, the customer?
Thanks for having me here. Appreciate that. So I've been in the edtech space for the last decade, right from the early days of Byju's. One of the failed products of Byju's, I was the reason for it. So I'll take the examples from there and primarily talk about this, right? Education, we don't realize, or at least we don't associate it. It's actually a very heavily regulated space, right? We typically think fintech is very regulated, but education is also there. So whenever we think about the direction in which we are heading to, right? There's a passionate way in which we want to use tech as much as we can in the classrooms, break the boundaries, implement as much as we can. But at the same time, a lot of the directionality comes from the policy making, right? That kind of puts a lot of boundaries, but in the current age, that is still quite enabling. There's a lot of opportunities that do come up there. A simple example of metaverse, right? So when that came up immediately at Career Labs, we are a little crazy on that, being in startups. So we just wanted to do something there. So what we typically do is we go to the colleges and we do a lot of workshops. So we said, okay, why don't we shift the workshop into the metaverse, right? So we quickly took one theme of the higher studies and said, okay, let me give an experience of going to Harvard for our students by building the campus in there and just letting them go and explore that, right? So things like that in terms of early adoption is quite exciting to see how it primarily engages students, how it basically helps them move a little forward into their destination and goals, right? That's fundamentally how we primarily see. Obviously, at the below that, there's obviously a business model which kind of guides what works, what doesn't work, right? EdTech as such has been, at least in India, in the last 5 years, it's been like crazy growth, as we call it a bubble. Right now the bubble is bursting. So some kind of consolidation is bound to happen. But having said all of these, looking forward, there is actually a lot of adoption potentials, not just in the K-12 space, that is a school space, as we talk all about. It's also in the college space and the working professional space. So.
I think it's going to open minds for students to have that opportunity to be in a Harvard situation where, you know, one would have never thought that they will ever experience that. That really is exciting. Probably.
Yeah,
They look at the fees and they say, okay, it's done.
Think about not everybody has the ability to be able to make that happen. But now this creates an opportunity for someone who may not be able to afford going into Harvard, but getting at least, a great experience of how that happens and go through that, right? I think.
Sumanta, I'm going to ask you a question about growth. Growth is like become a big topic in the business circle. Everybody's either a growth strategist, a growth mindset, all kind of stuff around growth. I want to talk about, as a company like Intuit, when you think about growth, do you think growth is driven primarily by acquisition, or do you think growth is a consumer-led growth? How does that big enterprise mindset evolving?
I think that's a very interesting question, and I don't have the perfect answer for it. But I'll try to explain in what I have learned, not only working at Intuit, but also over my overall professional experience. I think when we are building a product, we always start with why. Like, why are we building this product? And it always starts with the end user, the customer that we say, right? And that is something which is very, very fundamental and should be there in each and every touch point and every phase of when we are building the product. Right from when we are trying to ideate what are the problems that we really want to solve, why are we solving it is very, very important. Because our founder, Scott Cook, he has a very nice saying which says that fall in love with the problem, not the solution. So this is very, very fundamental, and if you just focus on what problems are we solving for the customer and why are we solving it, and what is the benefit that we are trying to get to the customer, be it in terms of saving time, in terms of saving money, or in terms of creating good confidence in terms of how they can go and do all of their jobs, whether it's a consumer or whether it's a business owner or even an enterprise, right? So just always start with a customer focus. Be deeply embedded in terms of, like, we always have been doing this for several decades, but now we have a fancy name called as customer obsession. So, but the elements of knowing your customer remains the same. And even in the first session, Gopi touched about it in terms of the first point was know your customer well. I think it's very, very important, irrespective of what role each and everyone in the team in an organization is playing, to be connected with the customer. Like, if you are a developer, I would strongly encourage that at least devote half an hour of your daily time getting to know your customer. Who are you building for? Why are you building that? If you're building a drop-down, try to focus on why will this user use this drop-down? Get to that level, right? So that's number one. I think the second one, which kind of touches on to your question around growth, right? I think it's more around how are you positioning your product. So building is one part of it. Once you have built it, which all of us in this room are very good at it, I think the next part is the most challenging, is how are you positioning your product and how are you pricing your product. So which essentially means that if you keep it simple in two axes, if you position your product in terms of what is the problem that I'm trying to solve for, and if a customer is coming to buy that product for me, what is the intent that they have in their mind? So knowing that intent and being at the right category, being at the right place is one puzzle that you are solving. The other piece of the puzzle is how are you differentiating yourself from others who are also trying to solve the same problem. So if you can differentiate yourself very, very well, and to the extent that no one can actually copy it, and we probably have a term called as durable competitive advantage for that. So what you are actually doing is you are not only solving for what the customer is trying to get to in terms of buying or using the product, but at the same time you have created such a differentiation that once the customer tries your product and eventually buys your product, they are not going to leave that. So positioning, pricing, and creating that unique differentiation is something which I would say is very, very important and very, very key for us, all of the product leaders, to really make a product successful.
Yes, sure.
So that's definitely, an important aspect. The other one that I've always seen work, and both of them will be very happy, is we work closely with all these so-called the technical thought leaders. And every company has these folks who are not just looking at what problem should I solve, because if you look and ask the customer, they won't know exactly what needs to be solved. These technologists are always thinking of what are some of the things that we can do that are cool and exciting. If I don't know how old the crowd is, back in 2001, Cisco went from digital analog phone to voice over IP. And that's a huge risk. And there were standards that were being thought of by the technology architects. I'm sure Cisco's competitors did that before. But we worked with our technical leaders and started testing waters in the market. And we made a huge bet on let's go in that direction at that time. And it was a huge, it's a huge risk, and it took off very well. But that would not have come from looking at the customer or incremental or something like that. So there is always that incremental aspect from the customer, and there's always the path-breaking one, which usually comes from the technical thought leader, and you can always vet that with the market. Think about it from both angles. One is a TAM expansion, one is running the business.
Great. I'm going to ask Deepak a question around, Deepak, like you probably are leading many big teams. How have you improved the collaboration between product management, engineering, and other aspects? Like, what are the things that you're putting in place to make those silos break down? Because I think we all have still a lot of areas where we find ourselves working in silos.
Absolutely. Great point in terms of, I'll give you an example. Even actually, I do have teams both from a product management point of view, as well as engineering perspective and what have you. Even similarly, even in my previous role, I had a global role where my VP of engineering was sitting in California, with a different set of number of engineers sitting across the globe, who all directly reported to me. Exactly in terms of, especially when they're geographically distributed, it's very easy for it to become silo. And guess what? The last 3 years has only made it worse. Because you're only talking to your team on a regular day-to-day basis. You're not actually having those water cooler conversations. You're not really, going and playing foosball with somebody, in your recreation room, or having lunch in the cafeteria with someone, what have you. And that, that seems to have changed, entirely, that we'll probably never ever get back to, that. So how do we look at, breaking some of these silos, right? A couple of the things that we are actively trying to do is, one, in terms of figuring out career paths for people to cross over. There are a lot of good technical people who have the right skill sets to also become, product people, right? In the sense that, whether they are product owners or product managers, there is a path to get to, right? You essentially look at it in terms of the development life cycle that you follow, and try to see if there is a path for people. So we have established a path that where a technical person could potentially get into product management going through a path. Second is really establishing a rotation program. This has actually worked very well in terms of in a few instances where we have been able to try that, including product marketing for that matter. There are a few product managers who can actually be good from a product marketing perspective. But not everybody. It's not everybody's cup of tea, right? I mean, you have to figure out who fits, those skill sets well, and be able to provide that opportunity for people to be able to rotate and, see if they actually like doing that and want to build a career, in terms of being able to do that. We've also noticed a couple of downsides to it. For example, when we have enabled, let's say, some of the architects or deep technical people to become product managers. They're more worried about how a solution is actually built by the team than actually the what the customer wants, or why we're doing all the things that you talked about just a few minutes ago, right? It's really about they're more worried about how is this architected. So when we make that shift in the role, we've got to be able to unlearn a few things and then learn a few things newly, and be able to kind of make that happen. Those are a couple of things that we have tried in trying to break down the silos. That has worked reasonably well, and one of those things that you need to watch out for.
Great.
And he removes sharp tools in the conference room.
Yeah, exactly. I now know why Intel put me into the rotation program and put me into finance rotation, which I had to really learn. It was a hard, tough lesson, but I think there was value in it. But that's
I think
a good
as
point.
a product person, that is actually very important. I would actually make sure that every product management leader goes through a finance, or just being able to see that. The reason why I say that is good is that a product manager is the one that actually tells the team in terms of why are we doing what we are doing, why should they be doing what they are doing, and why is it useful for the company, and making those decisions, right? And it has to be relevant. It has to be, most usually you're not doing it for charity anyway, so you have to really think about, how does it help? So that's a great opportunity.
Great. Prasanna, I want to talk about monetization, especially when we talk about a B2C side of things. There is a specific discipline one needs to have, which I think B2B lacks, for the lack of a better word. But I think, how do you take that fast pace, and what are the areas that you've seen that can be challenging in the future?
From a B2C perspective, education or any other products, when I speak from the perspective of a startup which is either 0 to 1, which is seed stage or pre-series A stage, or a startup which is series A or series B, right? So the idea is, if you're in seed stage, obviously you're experimenting with your product, you may not have hit your product market fit. So what happens at that particular point, the mandate need not be monetization, right? So at that point, we are trying to figure out, okay, how do we hit PMF, right? So how does a customer use, how long did they use, what do we need to do? So that would be the first phase in which we will try to solve for. But given the lineage and the DNA that I've come from, there's a very interesting hack we follow, right? We'll never have the product in hand, but we'll try to go and sell it, right? So that's fundamentally one of the first products what I was trying to build long time back in Byju's was, at that point, tablet became less than 10,000 rupees, right? So the problem statement was, we took it and said, okay, if computing power can go into the classroom. What all can we do, right? That was a very exciting thing that we wanted to do. At that point, EduComp and few other companies were actually growing. So the B2B route was something that everyone wanted to do. So we set up a team. We went across all over India. We made presentations. We went to all the different schools, met the chairmen, pitched the product. In the back end, we did not have the product, right? So that fundamentally was a feedback cycle that helped us to see, okay, they're willing to pay so much. They are willing to include that into their fees, X, Y, Z, and all. So that gave us an idea of saying, okay, how will monetization happen beyond the PMF stage, right? So that's one way of understanding it. The other way is obviously directly talking to customers. In the B2C space, we always say never listen to the customer, observe what they are doing. Because everyone will say, yes, yes, I need this. But when we try to go out and sell them and say, give me money, they'll be like, boss, this is not for me, right? So those are some of the pitfalls that we try to avoid by trying to think marketing and trying to think selling first, just to see whether we will actually be able to reach that milestone or not.
I just want to do a time check. How much time do we have now? 5 minutes, okay, great. So I want to ask a little off-topic question, and specifically, we talk about engineering being so predominantly being driven by a lot of men right now. So Pallavi, what are the things that you see in the future as far as women taking leadership positions in this role, and how do you see the landscape changing?
All right, this is my crystal ball moment.
I had to put you on the spot.
The honest answer is I really don't know. But what I can tell you about this is when I started in the industry, I started with, of course, there was one other company, and then I did my education, and then went into computer networking world, where you enter a room and I never saw it from the lens of gender. But now, after 10 years later, when somebody reminded me of it, then I said, there were no women in the room. But that didn't bother me because it's all
Right.
up here, whether you want to think about it from a gender perspective or not. Am I still on? Yeah. There are more and more women coming on board, but there are also, as Payal pointed out, a lot of self-doubt. It does exist even among male members in the industry, but because there have been very few role models that you can look up to in that particular gender, there's a little bit more self-doubt. But I think people are putting it out there, and they're, saying, oh, it's not just me. Everybody across the board can think through this. So there are more and more people coming, but at the same time, I do see, it's like when you start seeing, just like what he said, Harvard, when you start seeing what's going on there, you stand and think, do I really want this? Or am I happy where I am? Right? So I don't know. Right now it's a 50-50 mix. Companies are making conscious effort to bring that 50-50 mix. Hopefully we will see more. That's what I'm rooting for. And more than the corporate world, I make it a point to go to colleges, especially in tier 2, tier 3 cities, where that's where you'll find a younger generation that are more hungry. If I look at my own kids, I keep telling them, how do I build in that hunger, right? But if I go to tier 3 colleges and just talk to them, they at least look at you and say, yes, there is a possibility, right? They don't have to look at a male role model and say, is it possible for me or not? At least if they see that there is a possibility, I think there's a lot more opportunity. And in India, most of the time, we don't think twice about it. Yeah, women can do it, not a problem, right? Most of the time. So, yes, I am hopeful, but we've taken a long way to get to this place, so I don't know yet.
Okay, great.
Do you mind if I jump in for
please
30
do.
seconds?
I definitely would love
I
your
would-
perspective.
I'm just trying to jump in just because I'm very passionate about this whole aspect of diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity, right? In terms of how we look at it. I grew up in a household where I have a sister-in-law of mine who is actually being the first ever project director in the space organization, in the Indian Space Organization, right? She was the project director for the first ever, satellite vehicle that was launched for the first ever. There are a lot of us, right, from a women past. So I've seen a lot of her, and I'm motivated and impressed in terms just in the family. Having said that, right, I always, we talk about this and we look around. There is no, yes, we talk about, okay, our diversity is 30%, 32%, 35%, we are growing, 1 or 2% a year. All that is fine, right? But fundamentally, I would say, everyone who is sitting in this room or outside of this for that matter, it's not about, doing something for a cause, or it is not, it's because it is the right thing to do. For a number of years, we have done wrong. Just fundamentally wrong, right? And this is the time to set it right. And I think it's an onus on all of us to be able to set it right. Not just because you like it, because it's the right thing to do, one. Second, it's also proven that a diverse team, always works better. And I've seen this in my life in terms of having a diverse team that can work with you, always does better. There are more, ideas, there are more better way of being able to execute things, and various advantages to it. So I just wanted to
Great.
mention.
No, this is
I just want to add one more thing here at a very fundamental to human being level, and I witnessed this at my workplace myself. When you think of each gender, right, when you look at the other gender, you're coming from a point, you learn about the gender either from your parent or from your sibling. And if you've not had a good experience with that, or whatever experience that you had, you will view the other gender when you're interviewing them or working with them at the same level. And to give you a real life example, I had an employee came from you. That was that was a very revealing piece of information.
that's a great.
So what I request you all is when you're working with somebody else, please do not keep that. Try not to have that. It's built into us, but just be aware of that and try not to filter the other person through that.
As you can see, we
Very
can have a long conversation. This is an amazing panel, but we have come on time, and I want to wrap up with one question to all of you. And I want you to talk about one word or a statement that actually touches your personal philosophy on your mind. So just take anything that personal philosophy that you get inspired by.
To me, I'll probably take the liberty to say 2 words, okay, if you permit
Please.
that. I would say risk and courage. I think that's what defines my philosophy. I very much relate to what Payal was talking about. That's what I mean by risk and courage, in terms of making that fist and not the open end.
For me, it's always been just do it. Always you get
Nike.
Nike, yes. Just do it. And there are things that come to your mind. People will say a lot of things. You may course correct, but continue doing it. You will find yourself in a better position.
I think for me, I will again repeat back to what Payal said, the difference between can I and how can I. So the thing would be, you can actually bring the change.
Well, being in the startup space, we need a very solid foundation for what we are doing. For me, if it's a life worth living, you better serve others and create some impact. So we always work in the space that creates as much impact as we can. So that's my base.
Thank you all. Thank you, everyone. That was great. We don't have time for Q&A, otherwise they all will be away from their lunch, and that might not be nice.
Yeah, thank you everyone for your time. We have some gifts, so may I call upon Srivatsan from Zozo Day to present the gifts.
Yes, yes, you have a minute.
I'm just taking a moment to make a plug here. Primarily during weekends, I work with a lot of aspiring entrepreneurs to help them with their prioritization, pitch deck, and the business case. So if anyone is interested, just look me up, or I'll be in the desserts counter eating sweets. So.
Prasanna, I'm already taking you up on that. We have 4:30 startup pitch deck competition today. You are going to sit on the jury. There you go. You asked for it.